Chapter 11, that's where we're going to pick up again. I say again, for those of you who've been with us for a while, Daniel 11 has been a long chapter for us. Taking a break in the middle of it didn't help any either, but we've been in Daniel chapter 11 now. I think this is the third week of it, and Lord willing, Jesus doesn't come back for the end of it, we'll finish it today. And if he does come back, you'll find out whether or not I was correct. So one way or another, you'll get some profit from Daniel chapter 11. Yeah, I think it'll be like on the way up, you'll be looking at me going, not even close. Okay, maybe not. I don't know. Let me just kind of remind you, though, of what we've been seeing and what's been going on in this chapter. This has been, I'd say, an unfamiliar chapter for most of us, and just understanding how the chapter is put together and what exactly God was revealing to Daniel. I think it's important. So just as a quick reminder, this actually started back in Daniel chapter 10. Daniel really towards, getting towards the end of his life, God gives him one more set of information, one more vision. The angel had showed up. He's seen a vision of Jesus there on the river, and the angel shows up, and we find out that the reason for that is God has some things about the future he wants Daniel to record for him. This is to be an encouragement both to the people that are going to be after him and also some information about the end times. So that was chapter 10, kind of laying the groundwork. Then we got to chapter 11, and he describes now he's talking about things that are going to happen in the future. These are events that would happen several hundred years after Daniel. These conflicts that would take place between what Daniel calls the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And remember, we went through all of this before, that those kings of the north, those Syrian kings, and the kings of the south, the Ptolemaic kings, and the conflicts that went on between them, with Israel kind of caught in the middle. And he told us that history in order to build up to one of the last of those, especially the Syrian kings, the kings of the north, a man by the name of Antiochus, a Greek general who becomes the king, and he becomes a great persecutor of Israel. And so that's where we ended up last time, with the history, if you will, prophetic history of Antiochus Epiphanes and the persecutions and the things that he was going to do against Israel. And we found out all of that comes about. The reason why God wanted to tell them about Antiochus is because Antiochus actually becomes kind of a preview. It's a kind of a foreshadowing of another great persecutor of the Jews that, from our perspective, is still yet in the future. And that's this individual. We usually refer to him as the Antichrist. It's kind of ironic. That's probably the least used term in Scripture for him. But that, for whatever reason, for us, that name has stuck. And so this last passage that we're going to look at is really, again, now looking into the future for us, future events of this individual, the Antichrist. And we're going to see, again, we'll be reminded of the parallels between Antiochus and this individual. We'll find out why God talked about Antiochus so much, to preview what this individual would be doing. It kind of helps inform us to kind of see, okay, this has happened before. These similar things are going to happen again. It's a way of God giving us additional information. We can be informed of the future by what's gone on in the past. But we're going to pick up in your Bibles there in verse 36. And just to kind of remind ourselves what happened, go back up to verse 35, the last verse that was talking about Antiochus specifically. It says, "And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, to purge, to make them white to the end, till the time of the end, for it is yet for a time appointed." That sounds like a statement of conclusion. And it is. That's all of the history about Antiochus that this passage is going to record. Now it's going to continue in the next verse to talk about a king. And it's going to talk again about a king of the north. But now we're going to transition into this other individual, this part of the story that hasn't happened yet. And just to kind of walk through that a little bit, how do we know, why do we think that this is now talking about a different person? Why is this no longer, starting in verse 36, talking about Antiochus? Well, part of it is the finality of verse 35. Verse 35 does seem to describe the end of the individual that he was describing, that he was talking about. So you do kind of expect that individual's story is done. And we have had multiple kings of the north that have been being described. We've had previous kings that were all just referred to with that singular title. So to have another king of the north referring to a different person is really not at all unusual in this passage. Also, it makes sense to see a different person in view, because the things that are going to be said from verse 36 on were statements that were never true of Antiochus. Now, if you've been tracking with us for the last couple of weeks, I mean, the parallels between the prophecy and what actually happened have been, absolutely incredible. Down to marriages that would occur, and treaties that would be made, and invasions that would take place. Just prediction after prediction after prediction after prediction, they all came true. All of a sudden in verse 36, though, none of these things ever happened to Antiochus Epiphanes. It's going to talk about a victory over Egypt. Remember, Antiochus never did defeat Egypt. It's going to talk about him setting up his palace, his base of operations in Jerusalem. That never happened to Antiochus. I mean, you're just going to see a bunch of stuff here that is not true of this individual. Well, it'd be kind of ironic if this was still talking about Antiochus to be right, wrong. That would kind of be unusual. That would be strange for as specific as the prophecies were for them all of a sudden to get so many things wrong. So again, we're going to look back on this and reflect on, well, this must be talking about someone else. And then we've already seen in the book of Daniel precedent for this. We saw in Daniel chapter 7 the Antichrist being described there. Remember, he was called that little horn that ends up persecuting the Jews and gets judged by God. And we saw in chapter 8 a prophecy about Antiochus, who persecuted the Jews and committed the abomination of desolation. And we said the reason God did those was to lay them side by side. They were intended to kind of illustrate each other. Well, it's no surprise that this chapter does the same thing. He's been talking about Antiochus. Now he talks about the Antichrist, and you're supposed to see some parallels of character, some parallels of actions and things. There are some places where they kind of overlap. And that's not going to be unusual in prophecy, for God to be looking at something, describing something in the future, and calling attention to parallels between them. So, all that being said, starting in verse 36, we're talking about now this new individual, this little horn that Antiochus was a picture of. So before we get into those verses, let's just remind ourselves of this question. What do we already know? If these chapters are, if this is going to be information about the Antichrist, because this isn't the first time that Daniel's addressed him. This isn't the first prophecy that Daniel's been given about this individual. We did see information in Daniel chapter 7. We saw more information in Daniel chapter 9. So before we go any further, I want to kind of remind us of what we've already seen. What does Daniel already know that now this information is going to supplement for us? So let's just kind of walk through this. First of all, we said that he is associated, this Antichrist individual, he's associated with some sort of connection with the Roman Empire. And remember how we understood that back in Daniel chapter 7. He called him there the little horn. And remember, that came out of that fourth beast. It was connected to that fourth beast, which was a picture of the Roman Empire. There's some sort of connection between this individual and Rome. Again, he doesn't go into a whole lot of detail as to what that is and how that happens, but it's some sort of connection that he has with Rome specifically. And another connection that he had with Rome was that in Daniel chapter 9, remember it said the people of the prince that shall come would destroy the city and the sanctuary after Messiah came. Well, again, we know who that is. We've got the history books to tell us that. It was the Romans who destroyed the city of Jerusalem. It's Romans who destroyed the temple in AD 70. Well, those are what's referred to in Daniel chapter 9 as his people. So some way, some shape, somehow, this individual is connected to the Roman Empire. Some other statements we've already been told about the Antichrist by Daniel is that he would be politically and militarily powerful. That this individual would be hugely influential, both with military might and especially political might. Think about some of the details that we've been given. Daniel chapter 9, we were told that this prince that would come, this Antichrist, that he would negotiate a 7-year peace treaty with Israel. Ultimately, that would facilitate the rebuilding of the temple. It was destroyed by his people, but somehow he's going to arrange it to where it would be rebuilt. And we talked about him entering into a covenant with them for 1 week, that period of 7 years. So he's doing some incredible things politically. We also saw even militarily. In Daniel chapter 7, remember it described this organization that came out of that fourth beast, some connection to the Roman Empire, but was made up of 10 kings. And we saw there that this little horn kind of assumes control. He takes out 3 of those other horns, and he becomes kind of a dominant personality. So he's not just good politically. Apparently, he's pretty good militarily. He's able to conquer some territory. And as far as the time frame here, his greatest power, we saw from Daniel chapter 7, seems to be for about 3.5 years. He enters into a 7-year peace treaty with Israel, but he really doesn't kind of become the guy until about halfway through that. And Daniel chapter 7 said that the time of his domination would be for a time, times, and a half a time. 3.5 years of where he's in full power. That would correspond with what we consider especially the second half of the tribulation. So again, this is an individual that is very politically adept, militarily greatly accomplished. Spiritually, we also are told about his attitudes toward God. Specifically, we've been told already that he is anti-God and anti-God's people. We saw in Daniel chapter 7 that what was notable about him, what impressed Daniel about him, was this little horn with a big mouth. That this mouth speaks great things and boasts great things against the Most High. It's almost like he's intentionally and purposefully blasphemous against God. He's boisterous in his blasphemy. Certainly he's opposed to God's plans. We saw in those passages in Daniel chapter 7 that his goal is to change the times, that he's trying to reorganize things under his control rather than God's control. God has promised certain things to happen, and his goal is to try to prevent those things from occurring. He's opposed to God's plan. We saw in Daniel chapter 7 that he's opposed to God's people. The phrase that was used there is he wears out the saints of God. And one of the things that shocked Daniel was how devastating this person is, going after God's people. Specifically, certainly a reference there to the Jewish people, but that phrase, the saints of God, is a little more broad too. That could include other believers during this time, people who are trying to trust God. If you go with God, then you're automatically this individual's enemy. So he persecutes God's people. And then we saw in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, that his notable characteristic is for desecrating God's temple. That he's going to arrange this peace treaty with Israel, but it says in the midst of the week, he causes the sacrifice and oblations to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations, he makes it desolate. I mean, just strong language to say this guy is just making God's temple unfit for worship. He's prohibiting people from worshiping God. An awful, awful character. So a lot we've already been told about Daniel, and one more thing we're told from Daniel about this Antichrist is that despite all of his military power, despite all of his political acumen, despite his blasphemies, despite his opposition to God and God's people and God's temple, he doesn't win. We're told very specifically that he meets his end. He's defeated by God when the Messiah comes to establish his kingdom. Daniel 7 is very clear on that. Daniel 9, when it describes his desecration of the temple, it says that continues until the time appointed. That God is allowing this, but God's going to bring it to an end. And so as bad as he is and as awful as he is, he's not God. He doesn't overpower God. He doesn't thwart God's plan. He doesn't destroy God's people. His plans fail, and he's ultimately defeated. So we've already seen just in the book of Daniel a lot of information about this individual, this Antichrist. So with all of those things in mind now, let's start into Daniel chapter 11, verse 36. Now, what is Daniel supplementing? What additional is he telling us about this person? What new information, what further information is God going to share with the prophet? Verse 36, I'm going to suggest to you, kind of summarizes, it's a summary passage about this individual. Notice what it says there. This king shall do according to his will. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper until the indignation be accomplished. For that determined shall be done. Can you kind of see in that verse kind of a trajectory? Boy, he's doing whatever he wants. He seems to be just accomplishing his will. He's doing all of his stuff, and he's blaspheming. He's going through all of his actions until God says your time is done. This is kind of just giving us a brief summary, a brief overview of his activity. It says that he acts according to his will. He does as he pleases. It's kind of interesting, that phrase, he does according to his will, was actually used of God back in Daniel chapter 4. When God was describing his administration of his world, it says that God raises up and brings down nations. He does according to his will. That's true of God. This is a person who's a wannabe, though. He wants to do that. He wants to have that position of God. He wants to have that level of control. And for a period of time, apparently God allows him to, do what you want. Accomplish your purposes. But remember, this is ultimately, he can only do this because God says so. This is not because God's abdicated control. It's not because God is no longer able to withhold him. Kind of put this in a parallel with what we read about in Job, right? Job wants to tear up Job. He wants to destroy Job. And God keeps saying, well, you can go this far, but no more. You can do this, but no more. I mean, the whole time, Satan thinks he's doing something. And he's really just doing only the things that God allows him to do. This Antichrist, he's according to his will, but he's only functioning according to God's plans and God's purposes. It says that he shall exalt himself, shall magnify himself as above every god, and he shall speak marvelous things. The description here is he seems to have some initial successes. He does as he pleases. He initially prospers. And so what does he do with this newfound power? What does he do with this freedom that he's been given from God? He uses that opportunity to reject God. He rejects the true God. He demands worship of himself. He magnifies himself above every god. Shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. That phrase, marvelous things, we tend to use marvelous in a very positive way. Oh, that's marvelous. The word here, it still means something impressive, something that you would marvel at. I mean, you're like, wow. But notice what he's doing that's causing people to go, wow. It's like, how blasphemous can he be? How far in rejection of God can he go? People see what he's doing and they're like, wow. I mean, this guy is the epitome of evil. I mean, we look around even in our world today and we see people that thumb their nose at God and they know what's right and they do wrong anyway. And even that, we're kind of like, wow, that's pretty extreme. Apparently this guy just turns the dial up to 10. That what he does, people marvel at how blasphemous he is and how anti-God he has become. In this overview, it reminds us, though, that no matter how much he opposes God, he's still under the sovereignty of God. It says that he continues, he shall prosper until the indignation be accomplished. Indignation in Scripture always is a reference to God's wrath. That it's kind of giving us a hint that God's allowed this individual to prosper. God's allowed him to come to pass as part of God's judgment on the world. It's a consistent theme throughout Scripture is that if people say they want what they want, then God will sometimes say, I'll let you have what you want to show you that you don't really want that. In a world that rejects God, God gives them a leader that's the epitome of rejecting God. This is part of God's judgment on sinful mankind. This is part of God's indignation, part of God's wrath being poured out that lets this individual come to power. And he's going to continue until that determined shall be done, whenever God's will is accomplished. Whenever he's done everything that God allows him to do, then God will bring it to an end. And we've already seen this. We saw this back in Daniel chapter 7. God's kingdom is coming. The Messiah is returning. He's going to rule and reign. And when he does, all earthly powers, including this Antichrist, will be judged. So God says, yes, you have a period of time. You have a span where I'm allowing you to prosper. But it's going to end when I say so. So verse 36 is kind of just like a broad picture, an overview of this individual. We're going to get a few more details about him and his religious attitudes. We know he's a great blasphemer of God, but what does that mean? What would that involve? Verses 37 through 39 describe more about his disposition towards God. Verse 37 says, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. The picture here is, in a sense, an individual who's creating, and I put it in quotes there because, is anything really new? People have been rejecting God since Adam and Eve in the garden, but putting themselves at the center of the universe. So it's not really new, but notice the way it describes it. He's rejecting basically all previous religions, the religions that have gone before him, the religions, it says, regarding the God of his fathers. I know some people have looked at this and kind of wondered if this says anything about maybe his nationality. Is this maybe a Jewish person because he's rejecting God, the God of his fathers? That might make some sense if one of the things that he's going to do is try to trick the Jews into thinking he's the Messiah. It does make sense that he would have some sort of Jewish connection to do that with. But I don't know if that's so much the point of this passage as it is simply to say he's not regarding religions that have gone before him. This is not, it's not like he's just adopting some previous paganism. He's creating something new, a religion that revolves specifically and purposefully around him. That you will worship me. I am the God. I am the one. He doesn't regard the God of his fathers. He magnifies himself above all. It also says he doesn't regard the desire of women. And that's another phrase that, kind of, what does that mean? Again, I know some have taken that to be, well, maybe this indicates something about his sexual orientation. Maybe that's what it's trying to say. And I suppose that's possible, but the Bible does talk about those things, and it kind of has some general consistency into how it describes those things. It's not the phrase that's used here. I kind of wonder if this one isn't more about, kind of in the context of his rejection of God, to reject the desire of women there. That's a Jewish phrase that women used to talk about, looking forward to the birth of the Messiah. Ever since Eve, they've been looking forward to this one who was going to come. And so Jewish women looked forward to, it was the desire of women to be the mother of the Messiah. Either way, in the context, he's rejecting God. If it is his sexual orientation, that is a rejection of the image of God in man. Scripture is clear on that. And if it's rejection of the Messiah specifically, I'm not. I'm going to be as anti-Christ as I can. I reject the desire of women. The point is the same. He says, nor regard any God. He magnifies himself above all. This is, just fast forward in your brains, those of you who have studied passages like 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 talks about the Antichrist setting himself up to be worshipped as God. Revelation 13 calls him there the beast who forces people to accept his mark, to worship him, to declare their devotion to him if they want to eat or to sell or to transact business. He's enforcing worship of himself. That's characteristic of this individual. That's what this passage is saying. He magnifies himself above all. Verse 38 goes on to say, but in his estate he shall honor the God of forces. A God whom his father knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. The statement here is that while he's directing the world's attention to worship him, it's almost like secretly, behind the scenes, in his strongholds, he actually does have a God. There is a God that he worships. There is a God that he's devoted to. And this passage refers to him as the God of forces. That's a phrase that's sometimes used in the sense of military, like a military phrase like the God of forces, like his God is military might. I suppose that's possible, but the way the passage reads, it sure sounds like there's an individual that he's worshiping. He's giving it gold and silver and precious stones and devotion. And so I don't know that this is so much, while he is a military leader, I don't think this is so much that his God is military conquest. I think his God here is a God that he is devoted to, the one who is ultimately anti-God, the greatest of blasphemers, the one who truly does want to be in the place of God, who does want to ascend to the place of the Most High, who does want everyone's attention focused on him. I think this passage is telling us that's who he's truly devoted to. That this is an individual, while he claims to be everybody worship me, ultimately what he's trying to accomplish is he's worshiping Satan himself. And that kind of is very consistent with what we read about in Revelation 13. Revelation 13, this beast that is directing the world's worship of him is actually under the control of the creature that Revelation 13 calls the dragon. The dragon is the one that's giving power to the beast. He's the one that's causing these things to occur and allowing, in that sense, giving him the power to do what he does. I think this passage is reminding us here that this Antichrist, while he's directing the world to himself, is ultimately trying to direct attention to Satan himself. Verse 39, the second half of that verse, starts telling us something about his political career, which the rest of the passage is going to do. What does he accomplish politically? We know what his religious goal is. What's his political ambitions? Verse 39b says, He shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. Now, this is one where I'm going to just suggest something here, because the passage doesn't go through a lot of explanations here. It says that one of his things that he accomplishes is he gains power, and he does so through dividing the land for gain. Now, in the context, Daniel has been repeatedly fixated, if you will, on, appropriately so, on his homeland, the nation of Israel, the land. That it says here that one of the things this individual, this Antichrist, is going to do is divide the land for gain. He divides it up for personal ambition, to get something out of it. Again, while this passage doesn't go into additional information, remember some things we already know. We already saw from Daniel chapter 9 that one of the things this individual is going to do is enter into some sort of treaty with Israel that allows her to rebuild her temple. Again, I'm not trying to connect contemporary events to these. We don't know how far from these events we are. I'm just take it as proof of concept. Do we today hear repeatedly calls for Israel? Divide the land. You need to. If we'll have peace, if you'll give the Palestinians a state, if you'll divide the territories, if you'll give them this, if you'll give them it. And Israel's tried that before. I mean, she's given up land, she's given up territories. It still hasn't bought her any peace. But can you imagine a political leader coming in the world, actually negotiating some sort of treaty that may result in a division of the land of Israel, a parceling out of territories, but in exchange for that, permission to rebuild the temple? And all of a sudden now this person, you've brought peace to the Middle East. You have accomplished something great, dividing the land for gain. Maybe that's one of the ways these pieces could be fitting together, that it's describing here in this verse, this treaty that he's going to enter into with Israel that facilitates the building of the temple. At least a possibility with that. That apparently gives him some additional control and power that leads to another series of events. Look at verse 40. I guess I should put that one up there. He's powerful and influential in Israel. That's the description there. Verse 40, it says, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." The picture here is an individual who's going to experience a good degree of military success now. Up to this point, what he's primarily been doing is, kind of political, a peace treaty. He's negotiating. He's, okay, I'll give up, you give up this and you do this. He's kind of negotiating the things here. But you can kind of picture here a scenario where not everybody's excited about this peace treaty. Not everybody's still happy and thrilled with the direction things are going. And so picture this individual who negotiates this treaty with Israel. They begin rebuilding their temple, but what else happens? Well, according to this verse, it says the king of the south shall push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. It facilitates a war, a battle that's going to occur. If you want to put this in parallel, if you read through Revelation again, I go to Revelation chapter 6 when it's describing the events unfolding during this tribulation period. The first seal is the rider on the white horse, a picture of the Antichrist. The very next seal that's broken is the red horse, picture of war that breaks out after he comes about. I think that's what this is describing, that the kings of the south previously in the passage referred to those areas of North Africa, Egypt, and the surrounding nations. Can you picture, there's peace in Israel. Other Arab nations not being very happy about that, not being content with the way things have gone and attacking. And it says the king of the north here, this Antichrist, fights back and apparently is very, very successful. It says that verse 41, he shall enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand upon the countries. The land of Egypt shall not escape. And he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. In other words, these nations attack, and he fights back and becomes extremely successful. I mean, you kind of just picture it. It talks about him just defeating Egypt and and Libya and Ethiopia, these areas of North Africa, these Arab nations that would attack them. And I remind you of what we've already been told about the Antichrist. There was this confederation of nations, and somehow he plucks out 3 of the horns and gains control of the entire area, of the entire process. Maybe what this is describing for us. So just look at the scenario there. He enters into a treaty with Israel. Israel rebuilds the temple. Surrounding nations attack, trying to stop it. Antichrist wins and assumes control over the entire region. He's got tremendous military success that he's experiencing. Verse 44 describes for us then the next step in this process. Tidings out of the east, it says, and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore shall he go forth with great fury to destroy, and utterly to make away many. He's just had this great victory to his south, but now he gets attacks from the north. Now he's got to respond to that. He's got to go back and make preparations for the next wave of attacks. Just when it seems his victory is complete, he gets word of the tidings out of the east and out of the north that force him to leave his conquest and march back to Palestine. Verse 45 says, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. The statement there, between the seas, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea, if Daniel still has Israel in mind here, the holy mountain right between those 2 bodies of water there, right in the middle of Israel, between those 2 bodies. He describes here him making now Jerusalem kind of his home base, his base of operations. The final events focus on Israel here between the seas. So again, kind of say, well, how does this fit with everything else we've been looking at? How does this fit with all of the other chronology? Well, if you, again, read the book of the Revelation, you will find that there is a passage there that talks about at some point during this tribulation, the kings of the east amassing this huge army and begin marching down towards Israel. This, drying up the river Euphrates to make a passage across and coming down. Imagine the Antichrist here. He's just defeated this army. Now he hears of another army amassing in his north. He's got to get ready for this battle. And if that is what's being described here, the way this all ends is, according to Revelation, what we call the Battle of Armageddon. This monumental worldwide battle that takes place in the north part of Israel. There's a lot of other prophecies that fit into that, but I think this is kind of foreshadowing some of those events specifically. Just kind of fit in some other scenarios here. Again, I understand we're dealing with things that haven't happened. So I make these statements humbly. And again, if we look back on this, we get to heaven, you look back on me like you weren't even close. I get it. I will accept that. I will own it. But just to see how these things do fit together, can you imagine his great victories in the south? I mean, he's facing overwhelming odds. He's just won a great victory. He comes out of that thinking nobody can stand against me. I am a God. He goes to Jerusalem and the temple that they have built to worship God. He says, no. We're not worshiping God there. You're going to worship me instead. All of those other elements that we know about Antichrist fit. I mean, there's a place for them in this picture that Daniel is describing here. That puzzle does all fit together, I think, very, very well. Making Jerusalem as his base of operations, his center of worship, and having a period of time where he is in unparalleled control. Still facing, yes, some opposition. There's still battles that he's going to have to fight. But don't miss this part. Look back at the end of verse 45. Notice how it describes how this all ends up. Verse 45 says, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. He's at the epitome of his power. He's convinced, I'm going to rule the world. I'm God. No one can stand against me. And Daniel reminds us once again, it doesn't end well for you. Your blasphemy against God, your rebellion against God has not gone unnoticed. Your devotion to Satan will not get you what you want. This is going to end with God's glorious kingdom being established. You will be judged. You will be dealt with. And God's kingdom is coming. We're going to see more about that in the next chapter. I want to save chapter 12 for next week, but I will give you a spoiler alert here. If you want to know how it ends, you can read ahead. It doesn't offend me if you want to go ahead and read ahead. Chapter 12 is amazing, but chapter 12 is going to show us how this ends up. We've already been told he's going to be defeated. He's not going to give us a lot of information. He's not going to describe a lot of what happens during that last half of the tribulation. Daniel 9 didn't either. Revelation technically doesn't either. There's not a lot of information given about that 3.5 years where he's in control. But no matter how bad it gets and no matter how awful it is, we're reminded God wins. And that, again, is the takeaway that we're going to leave it with for now. No matter how bad things get, no matter how much our world seems opposed to God, no matter who ends up being in charge, and yes, I'm talking about Tuesday, no matter what direction we perceive things to be going, understand God has a plan. God has a purpose. It is the responsibility of God's people to do what's right. We make choices. We do what we're supposed to do. We do all that we can do. And then we trust God. That God, you have a plan. You have a purpose. I know how it ends. I've already read the spoilers. No matter what happens next week, God, your kingdom is coming. And I'm going to look towards that end. And I'm going to work towards that purpose. And I'm going to continue to be grateful and thankful for a God who is truly in control. So we will look at chapter 12 next week and see how close we can come to finishing out the book of the Revelation. Let me just, really one announcement for you today, and that's just a reminder that next Sunday is our class fellowship. We're going to be over at the gathering place, so we'll just head over there right after church. There is a sign-up sheet out on the table, and there are still some slots available. So if you and your family we invite you to join us, and if you want to stop at the sign-up sheet out there and maybe sign up for a couple of things, we're going to do kind of like a taco meal. So there's all sorts of components to bring. Some that, if you don't have a kitchen, there's stuff that you can do. If you do have a kitchen, there's stuff you can do. But if we can fill in all those slots on your way out, that would be perfect, so we know we have enough food. Yeah, we'll have somebody there before Sunday school if you want to drop stuff off on your way in. That'll be available for you. And then, remember the reason we're doing for it, not that we need a reason to eat, we're Baptist, but the reason we're having the fellowship is that we're going to be assembling giggle bags for Micah's Pantry. All the supplies are in. I looked this week, there was one item left and now it's gone. And so as far as I know, we have all the supplies ready to go. The kneaderers will be there. They're going to join us for the meal, and then as soon as we're done eating, we'll line up the tables like we've done before, put the bags out, and if past history is any indication, we'll finish that up in about 15 minutes. It doesn't take long because of many hands making light work, but it's a great ministry to be a part of, to be able to provide some things for these kids that are checking into the hospital, and it just gives them some toys to play with, some things to occupy their time while parents are filling out paperwork, and some distractions for them. It's a huge ministry. She's already given out, I think we've made alone, 350 of these. And, unfortunately, they get gone quick because there's that many kids going through the hospital. So we're going to try to do 200 this time. And so if you can make plans to join us for that, that would be amazing. So check the sign-up sheet on the way out, and we'll see you back here next Sunday. Have a great week.